Now, our next speaker is Dr. Greg Treverton. In 2019, we, SMA, published a white paper for the Undersecretary of Policy and Department of Defense titled, "Where Will Russia Strike Next?" And in that paper, we discussed the complexities of Vladimir Putin's approach to Ukraine. Now, last year, Dr. Treverton wrote a paper for us called The Russian Riddle, reflecting on Winston Churchill's description of Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. In his words in 39, like so many other quotations from Winston Churchill that are attributed to him and are perhaps very relevant today, they really eloquently captured a sense of Russia as the other, inscrutable and sometimes menacing, a power that plays by its own rules, usually to the detriment of those who choose more transparent conduct. And of course, we now know that Russia invaded Ukraine this morning. Our prequel, unfortunately, very unfortunately, and our prequel actually displayed some images from this morning's newspaper and media. And so we welcome Greg back to our town hall to offer his thoughts on Putin and Ukraine and other observations from a lifetime of experience as a senior national security and intelligence advisor to the U.S. Now, Dr. Treverton is an SMA executive advisor and professor of the practice of international relations at the University of Southern California. Let's head on over to Greg. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks, AJ. I would say it's a pleasure to be here, but it's a somber day. It's a day we didn't expect to have. We thought that this kind of aggression in Europe was history, even ancient history, 75 or 80 years old. But unfortunately, we're right in the middle of it. The most obvious thing to say, I think, is that so much depends on that hardest of intelligence targets, and that's what's going on in Vladimir Putin's brain. This is a reminder, I suppose as a reminder, it goes back to Sun Tzu, that the purpose of all strategy and warfare is ultimately to influence that 2 inches of gray matter inside somebody's head. And let's hope there's still an opportunity to do that. What I'd like to do is start with the things I got wrong, I and most other analysts, I think, then turn to where we are, then turn to how we got here, and then maybe just say a few words about what next. First, what I got wrong. Well, I assumed, and assumption, as I often say to my students, is the father of fuck up. SMA methods have that similar thought, but in better language. But I assumed that what Putin was up to was calling attention to himself, which he always likes to do, and creating bargaining chips for a negotiation with the United States and NATO to try and get us to pay more attention to his security situation. I assumed that because it seemed to me that a full-scale assault on Ukraine was nowhere in his interests. Why would you want to buy yourself an insurgency and bring down the wrath of the world and sanctions on your head? It just seemed too costly for me to imagine. Also, his pressure on Ukraine has only pushed the Ukrainians further westward. The NATO issue and Ukraine wasn't an issue a year ago. It's really Putin that's made it that. And so it seemed to me that an invasion was the worst of all possibilities for him. Well, I got that wrong. And that makes me think of, you have to ask what Putin fears as well as what he wants. My sense is that he does really feel that he has to have Ukraine as either a part of Russia or as a plainly vassal state. Now, why he thinks that is, I think, an interesting, harder question. He's talked for the last year at least about how Ukraine wasn't really a state. Those statements, I think, would come as a surprise to most Ukrainians who actually do think they have a state. I wrote earlier this year that sometimes the Biden administration tends to behave as though it's still 1992. Putin seems to think it's still 900, the epoch of Kievan Rus, as Sarah reminded us. So it may be that that's part of his motivation. Another part may be fear. And there I think he has the fear that if Ukraine were tolerably democratic, moved westward, it could serve as a model for a kind of a color revolution, maybe even including in Russia itself. So there is, I think, a fear and paranoia going on there. And the other element may be that sort of a turnabout, that since he talks a lot about how NATO comes right up to Russia's borders, taking over Ukraine would take Russia right to the borders of a whole set of new NATO states and would change the strategic situation in Europe. Just a word about good news. The good news is that NATO has stayed so cohesive. The administration, I think, deserves high marks for consultation, putting together this coalition. Even the Germans, who I thought would be very difficult because of Nord Stream 2 and their energy dependence, they've immediately said Nord Stream 2 is not going to be certified, won't have any effect in the short run, but is an important symbol of NATO cohesion. So that's, if there's a glimmer of good news here, it's that the NATO alliance has stayed pretty surprisingly together. How do we get here? Historians are going to write about this. Many trees will lose their lives and computers will lose their screens over this issue as we go forward. Exactly what happened at the end of the Soviet Union, what understandings Mr. Bush and Gorbachev had or didn't have is a little bit murky. I think there was no evidence that we committed, that they committed us not to expand NATO and not to expand NATO even up to Russia. But certainly the Russian expectation was that that wouldn't happen. In Gorbachev's time, there was still the thought that there would be a Russian-led federation, and some of the Eastern European countries like the Balts would join NATO, but not all of them. And we'll continue to debate whether we should have taken Russia's security concerns more seriously during the 1990s. It's worth remembering that there was a period of cooperation. We cooperated over space, over removing nuclear weapons, including from Ukraine. And Putin was the first to call George W. Bush after 9/11 to offer his support in the war against terrorism. But I think as we look back, maybe we should have been more aggressive in trying to create arrangements that would include Russia in security arrangements in Europe. After all, if would we like Mexico to be a member of an alliance of which we weren't a member? I think probably not, but we'll continue to debate exactly what we might have done, those might have beens, and wouldn't they have made any difference. Given that Putin seems fixed on Ukraine, absorbing Ukraine entirely, it's not obvious to me that any of those arrangements would have different, but they would have played out history differently. What next? There, the obvious answer is we don't know. It comes back to what Putin does and what the alliance does. It looks to me like we're in for a long slog. I would hope that there's still some opportunity for diplomacy. We don't want to cut off diplomacy, but each new action, each new attack, each new shelling makes diplomacy all the harder. So the immediate future is going to depend on what Putin does and how the United States and NATO respond. It's obviously going to be rocky in economic terms. We've already seen the effects on energy prices, even though physically nothing has happened to energy supplies in the world. But that will continue. We'll also find that supply chains, which are also messy, as we know after the pandemic, will include some commodities like palladium that turn out to be important and come from Russia. So there, the economic effect will depend really on how long this lasts. And given the current circumstance, it's really hard for me to be optimistic that we're going to get back to the negotiating table anytime soon. I hate to leave it on that note, but I'd welcome any questions or comments.
Great. Hey, thank you so much for your insights, Greg. I have a couple of questions for you. So let's actually start with, I think this morning, Vladimir Putin, was displaying some brinkmanship and actually perhaps gave a veiled threat over the use, or perhaps not so veiled threat over the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Any comments on that?
Yeah, that was really worrisome. And his language has been so intemperate throughout. His speech on Monday, I mean, it's really alternates between some analysis and a lot of rant. Mm-hmm. And that comment really makes one very nervous. We know that Russia has moved toward this doctrine of maybe using tactical nuclear weapons in a losing conventional war. So in that context, it has to make us worry. Absolutely.
All right. Indeed. It's a very frightful situation, I think, very particularly Europe. You kind of an interesting comment in terms of your thinking process, Greg. So perhaps more than two reasons for conflict. One being to gain a strategic objective. The other is to address a particular fear. as you reflect upon kind of the history of conflict, right? Can you talk a little bit about kind of which of those two you think have really kind of driven, major conflicts, and perhaps where this might take us with Russia as well as potentially with China?
It's a really good question. I think they're both very operative. It's what I keep going back and forth between what Putin wants and what he fears. And sometimes they come together. And maybe Ukraine is a place where they did come together, where he had something he wanted to do. He'd like to reconstruct the Soviet empire if he could, and a sphere of influence if he can't do that, and with the fear. So I think lots of times in history, those two do get mixed up, where what looks like ambition is also driven by fear. My sense is that's going on with China as well, that what Putin fears, I think, is time. We tend to think that the time is on China's side, but it's not. Demographically, they're about to fall off the cliff. And so much of Xi's behavior, I think, is driven by the fear that he can't make China rich before it gets old. And I see that combination very active in that, particularly in that aspect of China policy.
Greg, quick question in terms of the, how much of this do you think is really driven by the economics and some of the wealth, Bitcoin, gold, and other things that are inherent in Ukraine?
I suspect Ukraine's always been the breadbasket of Europe, so it's important in that sense, and there's certainly an economic dimension to it. But Putin has mostly, what he's done so far is mostly tried to keep Ukraine as a kind of an economic basket case. He hasn't entirely succeeded, but there are resources there. But we know, it seems to me, one of the things we've learned or should have learned by now is that occupying territory is probably the worst way to try and get riches. You're better off being attractive yourself and trading with people.
Right.
Indeed. There's an interesting question in the chat. I think a very relevant question. And I think something I've been curious about now for the last several weeks, which is I think Putin and many members of the Duma, state Dumas, have been kind of suspected of having manipulated markets around the world for personal wealth and enriching themselves. Is there any reason, perhaps, perhaps I know this is speculation, but why haven't we perhaps sanctioned those as individuals from further activity in the markets?
Yeah, I think we probably should have already, and we said there wasn't exactly a flashpoint to make it happen or to justify it, but we should have probably done it. Now is a good time to do it, and as we've seen, the EU has been very quick to put sanctions on individuals, to not let them take those nice trips to Monte Carlo and other places. So this is, I think, maybe an opportunity to do something that perhaps we should have done sooner.
Yeah, I think very early on, as this became very real 2 weeks ago, perhaps, I think Boris Johnson indicated that they'd likely actually perhaps consider repatriating some of the property that many of the oligarchs have purchased, bought in London, at least.
Yes, London has really been a hotbed of activity for those oligarchs, and they've been pretty brazen, and the Brits have been slow really to do something about it. So this is a good opportunity for them to act as well.
Indeed. Any commentary on, I think, as I would describe it, as a fairly uneasy alliance between Putin and the oligarchs in Russia over the last 20 years, and how that's kind of played out now?
Yeah, it's kind of had its ups and downs. I mean, I think that overall the oligarchs recognize that they're to a certain extent dependent on him, or at least dependent on his favor. So it's an uneasy, and he needs them in some sense for the money. So it is a kind of uneasy relationship. But I think in the end, he's been quite prepared to, maybe not as prepared as President Xi in China, but he's been quite prepared to discipline the oligarchs when it suits his purposes, or when he thinks they're becoming too big for their own britches.
Indeed. So another interesting pop-up question in the chat window. I think many of us had predicted that Ukraine would be the next target, particularly after his takeover of the Crimea Peninsula, which actually truly was strategic, I think, at least as many folks believed. Which country may be next?
Well, the most obvious one that's already happening is Belarus, where it seems to me he's already trying to absorb it and make it a part of Russia. So that's the next obvious. Beyond that, then you have to worry about, if they're wanting a corridor to Kaliningrad, which is now isolated. That puts Lithuania in danger. So they're And that takes us to a NATO member. So now the next steps would be extremely reckless, even more reckless than we've seen so far. So let's hope that part of deterrence works. We may not be able to do much about Ukraine in the short run. In the longer run, it may be that, Putin is the dog that caught the bus. But in some ways, let us hope that turns out to be the case, though that means suffering and dying for innocent Ukrainians, which is awful.
Indeed. I think Lithuania would be particularly troubling since that's a NATO state, and they've got the air patrol mission for NATO. So
it would be.
Yeah.
Greg, it's interesting that the Chinese this morning came out and said that they would buy everything that was available from Russia, as well as they're flying sorties over Taiwan. So they're definitely taking a position here. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's got to be a little bit uncomfortable for the Chinese, because on the one hand they want to be supportive of their, what do we call it? They're not their partner or ally, but their friend, or at least a common friend against a common enemy, us. But this got to be uncomfortable because they've always insisted on sovereignty and non-interference as paramount principles going back to the Third World Movement. So this got to be a little bit uncomfortable. My guess is there's at least pretty strong tacit cooperation between China and Russia. I think the limits on any real strategic alliance continue to hold, but there's got to be tacit cooperation. Plainly, Putin didn't act during the Olympics. My worry, I suppose everybody's worry, is that with us distracted, the world distracted by Ukraine, if she is tempted to make a grab for Taiwan, this wouldn't be a bad time. So that's kind of top of my list of things to worry about.
Well, and that actually brings back memories of World War II, right?
It does. It really does. It really does.
Really, that's so unfortunate. And well, it is where we are at. Greg, you alluded a little bit to perhaps one of the things that we might have done differently, which is perhaps 30 years of confusion about how to think about Russia. Right.
Yes,
I don't want to go into revisionist history, but can you just comment a little bit more on that?
Well, I think, if we, I mean, it turned out that we decided, and I was in the Clinton administration when this all got decided, that we would basically embrace NATO as the main organization for stability in Europe. The Eastern Europeans wanted to join, and it was hard to say no. Any idea of a kind of loose federation around Russia wasn't attractive to them. It wasn't as attractive to NATO, so it's hard to say no. In retrospect, what we probably needed to do was not say no, but say yes to something grander for Russia. We had this partnership council, the NATO-Russia Partnership Council, never really amounted to too much. We did, it seems to me, rather diss them, talk about them as, Ivory Coast with nuclear weapons. So a little more respect, I think, would have gone a long way. And we did rather relish being the unipolar power. Right. So if we, in retrospect, I think we had to play over again. I would continue to expand NATO. I might have been a little more careful about the last expansions, but the main thing would have been to try and create something that was pretty serious, probably short of NATO membership, but serious as a place in which Russia could feel a part of European security arrangements.
Yeah, I think on a perhaps positive note going forward, this could be a lesson for all of us, particularly those in national security around. Perhaps it is important to think about how to fast forward the present state to 30 years out in the future, right? And really, have some concern about that.
Yeah, like a perspectives lesson learned, AJ.
Yeah. And there's still, I mean, if Putin's main concern is really his place in European security, then there are lots of things we could do in negotiations. And we've mentioned lots of them.
Yeah.
We could have negotiations about intermediate nuclear weapons. We could have confidence building measures about troop movements. So we could make some agreements about where and how we would move American troops around. Lots of things we could talk about. But my worry is that Putin is now beyond the talking stage.
Indeed. Are there any other pop-up questions that I think we've got a minute or so left? Anyone wants to take perhaps Blake, if you could take a look at them.
Or just put them up on the screen.
All right.
Yeah, there was a question about Central Asia.
Okay.
And Putin has rather carefully distinguished Kazakhstan from Ukraine. So I think that they're probably not a natural next target. That also is a place where Russia and China collide. Russia thinks of Central Asia as its sort of sphere of influence, a proposition that the Chinese sort of laugh at, assuming that they're really the future of Central Asia. So that is a place where China and Russia are far from partners.
Yeah. Hey, thank you, Greg. One more question from Norm Cooling, actually, and I'll shorten it. It was a very thoughtful question, Norm, so thank you for posing that. I'll shorten it to the future of NATO. Is NATO at risk?
No, I don't think NATO's at risk. I thought when 1992 happened, I'd worked on NATO all during the Cold War. I thought, now I don't have to worry about NATO anymore. It turns out that NATO is alive and well, and in some ways all the more important because of this Ukrainian episode.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Greg, particularly on such a fateful day it is. And really welcome your insights and thinking here on this topic. And so,
absolutely.
Jacques, let's wrap up.